Hello, and thank you for joining us once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're continuing on in our section of Mitch Stokes' How to Be an Atheist book in the science section. And we're hitting Chapter 9, and we're talking about metaphysics, which Tony's going to have to explain to us what metaphysics is, because it seems very high and above us.
Yeah, metaphysics, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's the so actually the word came from the writings of Aristotle, the early Greek philosopher, and he wrote a book about physics. Actually, I think what happened was his students copied down notes and put it together as a book. And then there was a bunch of stuff after his discussion and lectures about physics, and they didn't know what to do with it because it really didn't touch on physics and that sort of thing. And of course, the word meta in Greek can be translated depending on the context and other grammatical things as after, right? And so they labeled these extra things that he talked about after physics, and so we translate metaphysics. So that's where we get the word from. That's the things that Aristotle talked about after he finished talking about physics, right?
The simple things like the nature of the universe and whether other people exist.
And so in the philosophical realm, it usually has to do with the study of the nature of reality. Right? What's the nature of reality? How questions about God, obviously, is a metaphysical question.
Time, the mind,
yes,
those things that seem really high above us. And don't quite seem like afterthoughts, but if you're Aristotle, I guess you can start wherever you want to.
Right, and so what Mitch Stokes here is trying to do in this particular chapter is he's having us consider, can we have a physics-based metaphysics? In fact, that's the name of this chapter, right?
Right.
Can we base our metaphysics on the physical aspect of things, right?
Is there a kind of a naturalistic explanation that we can get for things like other people's minds, the concept of time and dimensions, and why the universe has started and been ordered the way it has? Are we able to find these answers within physics themselves?
Right.
Because we see that when it comes to general relativity and quantum mechanics, it seems like those far extremes, new science, are being built as kind of these all-encompassing. We're finding the fabric of the universe, almost literally the strings that tie everything together.
String theory.
Yeah, exactly.
Fabric of the universe. That's where that came from.
Going back to Plato himself. So we see we see an attempt by, I think, scientists today to try and kind of unlock that. When they come up with theories for new ideas, like the God particle, like, oh, here's the thing that's really going to drive everything together, and they find it and they're like, yes, that's great. Now here's 22 other ones that we need to come up with in order to explain, a part of our theory. And in the last episode, we talked about, 10 to the 500th power of theories, which is, I think I did the math. It's something like 4.5 times the number of atoms in the universe. That's how many theories they have to go through. So someone's at a big blackboard just checking them off. So that's what we're going to look at today. And so Dr. Stokes talks about the fact that science doesn't tell us the truth about the fundamental nature of reality, which we looked at in the past chapter, despite its spectacular success regarding the parts of the world we can observe.
Yeah, and we know this because we have the two basic fundamental physical theories, relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and yet they are incompatible with one another.
Right.
So somewhere they've gotten it wrong.
Yes,
right?
Someone's tricking us. But they're both like Newtonian mechanics. You throw the ball up, the ball comes down. With quantum mechanics, we get things on the small end of the spectrum, quarks and the fine-tuned particles of the universe. But then on the general relativity side, we see things like stars and gravity, those things that are coming into play on the other end of the spectrum. But they don't seem to meet, and they come to contradictory decisions when they go out on those, as Dr. Stokes calls it, the branches.
Right. There's contradictory conclusions. Right. The experiments don't check out the way we would expect them to do given a particular theory, right? Yeah. Especially quantum mechanics.
Because we're still all trying to figure out what that is.
Yeah.
When it comes to the construction's behavior of matter, energy, and space-time, for example, there are good reasons, as scientists tend to either hold in private consideration or they are flat out about it, but it seems like the predominant theory is that God doesn't exist. So if they have a hard time with this type of understanding of providing us kind of the basic building blocks of the universe or how it's currently made up in the big picture, there are good reasons to doubt things that are what we would consider unobservable, those things that are kind of the paranormal, the things outside the scope that naturalism would expect to touch on.
Right. So in other words, if they don't get it quite right with regard to physical things that we can observe and that sort of thing, why would we expect them?
Yeah.
Right, from a skeptical point of view, to get it right about unobservable, such as God and demons and angels and soul and afterlife and that kind of stuff, if they can't get it right about these physical things.
Yeah, clean up your own house first type deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he goes on to say, science wouldn't necessarily be the most reliable source for these types of subjects. So we're going to look at whether or not that's entirely possible to even have a naturalistic physical description of what these metaphysical questions are.
Yeah. So he says, so then it seems to be a bit premature to use scientific premises to account for the origin of the universe, right? The origin of the universe, we might consider that, right, a metaphysical question, right?
Right, not just the fact that it started, well, that could be one too, but how did it start? Where did the original material come from? In what way, in what fashion did it start? There's always the attempt, things like the Big Bang, or before that the consistent state theory, that the universe that has always existed, or you have Krauss's model, which says like in a vacuum these different particles come to almost nowhere, but again, nowhere doesn't really mean nowhere when it comes to Krauss. So it's not the fact that it's at what was the speed of light at the very start of the universe. Well, it seems to indicate that it might have been faster or anything like that. It's just the fact of not what, but the why. Right.
And so he says we need to be cautious with regard to using these physics-based metaphysics with regard to religious metaphysics as well, right? Yeah. He said we should be cautious when saying, for instance, quantum mechanics, using it to garner support for the doctrine of the Trinity, as some people attempt to do, right? Trinity works like the EPR thought experiment that Einstein did and that sort of thing. Right?
So you draw these kind of parallels, which again, almost any parallel to the Trinity is going to lead you into heresy, either on purpose or an accident. But once you come to find out, hey, maybe this quantum holism is inaccurate, what does that do to people's understanding of then what you were teaching? If this was wrong, is your teaching of the Trinity wrong because you based your understanding of that with the underlying assumptions that this quantum mechanics theory came up with.
Right. In fact, he even suggests that we, in terms of religious physics, we need to be careful with regard to using physics like the Big Bang theory to help us to prove the existence of God and all that kind of stuff as well, because again, Big Bang has to do with general relativity, and one of these theories may or may not be the theory, right? So we need to be careful by basing our arguments on these types of theories.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we have things like the teleological arguments and things for the Goldilocks zone. So if it was just a little bit farther, a little bit away, but even that has kind of a false theory behind it because is this the only way that life could have evolved? If it did evolve, in what sense and capacity does life arise in this universe?
He's going to really talk about that in the next section, right? Yeah. So he says, we could base our metaphysical arguments on those parts of physics which we actually observe, or those parts of physics we think will survive any scientific revolution. And in the case of the former, he says it will take some serious self-control to keep metaphysical pronouncements within the evidential constraints. And within the latter, we need to be careful about projecting into the future what may or may not happen.
Yeah,
right?
and good luck trying to find something that doesn't upend the spectrum. Once you realize that you can move out of 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions, then you start questioning things a part of that too. And so how do you come up with anything from any starting point that would survive any scientific revolution?
And so it's a pretty interesting quote here that he gives us by.
Yeah, it was really good.
Right, because Monton, I think is his name. He's trying to make the case.
Bradley Monton.
Yeah, he's trying to make the case here that science will probably never be able to answer our most important philosophical questions. So what's he?
Yeah. Monton's quote here says, "The history of science is full of seemingly insoluble gaps in the understanding that has never been filled in naturalistically. For example, we don't know the nature of consciousnesses or how conscious mental activity arises out of physical brain activity. So I want to move my arm. There, I've moved my arm. How did I do that? Is it just chemicals, or is there something else that's controlling it? We don't know why the universe exists. Again, why being a philosophical question. We don't know why there is something rather than nothing. We don't know why the universe has 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. We don't know what the nature of mass is. We don't know what the universe is made of. Most of it seems to be dark matter, but we don't even know what dark matter is or if it exists. That's just a placeholder for,
something we don't know.
There seems to be a lot more gravitational activity and mass in the universe. But it's just dark. We can't see it. There we go. He goes on to say, we don't have a single fundamental theory of physics, which we talked a little bit about last time. The 2 theories we do have, general relativity and quantum theory, are incompatible. The list could go on. Thus, it's reasonable, here's the point, thus it is reasonable to be cautious in assuming that any new gap we discover will naturalistically be filled in as well.
Yeah, so if the naturalistic explanations can't fill in these various issues, even, why would we think whatever else comes up, right, would fill these issues? And these are questions, metaphysical questions, that the study of the physical universe seems doesn't allow us, or it's difficult to think that will allow us to answer these types of questions.
Yeah, and we go back earlier in the book. We talked about the billiard balls hitting each other. The question isn't here. What did they do? We know once one strikes the one, it moves away. The question is why. You see it happening. You can say, the force of one pushed the other force away, but there's no explanation for the metaphysical why of why it happens.
And so he says, even if it's not impossible to infer metaphysical conclusions from scientific premises, it's a risky business, right? Right? Especially at our level of scientific knowledge. Right?
Yeah, it seems like we are starting over again. It's what we talked about last time is scientists didn't sit around before Newton and say, well, I know we got it wrong, but we're almost there. It's like, no, here's the paradigm. We're existing in it. It seems to work, and we do the bloodletting and all the other phrenology and the things that phrenology came later, of course, but the attempt to do science within that framework, and then holes start appearing, planets start appearing, movement of planets start to be discombobulated, technology is formed.
Or Mercury, rather.
Yeah. And then you have this revolution, and that's kind of how science has always been. And so we exist now in the state of quantum mechanics is the answer. Look at all the TV shows. Everything is quantum tachyon. Right. You watch Star Trek, and you can see where science pretends to be at in the future. You see the sci-fi shows where it talks about quantum mechanics, and as Mitch Sosa would say, that there's probably some truth within quantum mechanics, but whether or not the entire branch is going to find you the truth, especially when it's in conflict with what we see in relativity, it doesn't seem like we're going to come up with something within that field. It seems like we have to go through another round of revolution. But it seems like we're just in that early stage of even figuring out, we're the monkeys hitting the bones right outside the 2001 Space Odyssey obelisk.
Yeah. So then he says, so when is it proper to use science to help us answer philosophical questions? He says, I wish there were an easy answer. Perhaps the best we can do is to take it case by case, but perhaps there's something we can say here. He says that we might be able to identify the general whereabouts of the cliff's edge. When it comes to the laws of the universe, it simply isn't within the purview of science, not even cosmology and particle physics, to explain the origin of these laws, right? So there now we can at least get some take on where one discipline ends, the other starts, or vice versa, and that sort of thing. He says we can say that the universe behaves this way or that way, but just why it behaves this way is something that science isn't equipped to handle. Of course, science can give us approximate explanations and causes, but never ultimate ones, or so it seems to him anyway, right?
Right. And we do see in the second part of this book the attempt by scientists, physicists, and naturalists to try and scientifically explain, why you shouldn't do things, or why you ought or should or can't. And here it's saying, well, who really believes the fact that you can put up an equation on the board, and by the time you get done with it, you can say, don't kill neighbor equals don't kill neighbor. Like, okay.
Or give it, right.
So if no one really understands that, here...
A physical explanation about why it's immoral to kill the neighbor, right? Yeah.
And yes, there are good things that you can come up with for excuses, utilitarianism or survival of the fittest, depending on which way you want to go with that. But if it's a struggle for us to kind of have that understanding there, we should understand that there are limitations of science. There are hundreds of discussions we have even today, things that have been going on for millennia, on exactly what where that divide is, and the social ilks of society and problems and understanding. Even economic issues fall into that. Like if you have communism, there's the understanding that humanity is basically good, and sharing ends up becoming the ultimate good on top of that. But then you have things like those darn Christians that believe in original sin and people are born evil, and so then you have the system of like capitalism that works within that framework, and subjective value rather than intrinsic value within just doing work. So all those things inform things, and we wouldn't say here's where science can come in and save the day and swoop in and give us an equation, or titrate a tube that it turns green when you're right and red when you're wrong, or something along those lines. So having this attempt to come up with answers that are outside of a purview of science, again, as Mitch Stokes would say, does a disservice to what our understanding of science is. We need to understand there are limits, and those limits are fine. There's no reason for it, unless if you have preconceived ideas like naturalism is all there is, because then how do you define things like numbers, laws of logic, morality, any of those type of things? So that's what I think he's building the case here.
Yeah, right. And so his next section is, what about design arguments, right? These are arguments that say, hey, look,
this is where he critiques our end of the spectrum.
Yeah, right. Things perceived, they look orderly and that sort of things, and design, and therefore there must be a designer, right? And so he says, he says, and he kind of critiques these, but his bottom line is something like this. He says, it is unreasonably rational and that will require a non-natural explanation for some of these things. He says, I think that no matter how far we push back the natural veil on physical phenomena, there will always be good reason to think that the whole shebang requires a divine designer. But something important is overlooked. Though some sort of general design argument might be counted as evidence for a designer, I don't think that such an argument is nearly as strong as, and here's the important part here, our intuition or instinct that the cosmos has been designed. So notice what he's getting at is, we might be able to get to design, perhaps, but he doesn't think we get to it via argument, that is, via inference based on, propositions, right? That it's something that we get through intuition or instinct what he suggests here, Plantinga suggests our perception of things, right?
Which, again, is kind of a different take, and one of the reasons why hopefully people watch this show is when you think of a debate, atheist versus Christian, what are they arguing? They're arguing the historicity of Jesus, or whether or not it's possible for the resurrection to have occurred through these different sources, or if you have the great William Lane Craig saying, here's the Kalam argument to say it's more likely, it's more possible that the universe started at a single point, and then it came down to a divine directive, and then that directive is personal, and then you have him enter into creation. So it's building this kind of cumulative case of scientific propositions that are
or philosophical propositions even.
Yeah, I mean, we would say that there's probably a distinction that isn't being talked about there. But when you have kind of a presuppositional approach, you are starting out with the fact that, hey, we need to look at a worldview, and what does your worldview entail? To say, okay, you can have the fact that the moon looks like it's old. That's in your camp. We'll take the fossils, and so there's this attempt to try and say, okay, God doesn't have purview over that. God does have over fossils, but presuppositional comes in and says, no, by supposing the biblical Christian God, he tells us that he has given us an understanding that he exists, and it's kind of imbued into us, that it's our intuition that kind of derives that belief. On top of that is probably not outside of there, because he'll go into that more, but that through those understandings we know that God exists. And so this argumentation that he's going into, that, and Plantinga does too, falls right in line with presuppositional understanding.
Yeah, good. So he uses this rather mundane example here. He says, in the case of perceiving that there's a table before me, right? I perceive the table before me. He says, I do not make a quick and dirty inference from things appearing to me table-wise to the conclusion that there is indeed a table before me, right? And we don't make that inference. Look, this appears to be table-wise, right? Therefore, there's a table, right? He says, rather, I just find myself believing that there's a table. And this belief is so automatic that it's merely tacit, right? Yeah. It's just, it's part of just it's just part of the deal, right? The given is what one philosopher put
when my
right?
wife comes home from work, I don't sit there and test to see am I just perceiving that she's there, or do I just say, hi, honey, welcome home?
Yeah. Or am I inferring that, let's see, I heard a car drive up, I heard the door close, the garage door, came open, I heard the door open in the house. There is a person-wise figure in front of me. Yeah. And it's time that my wife usually is home. Therefore, probably this is,
I can kiss that person. Yeah. My father-in-law has just had his mustache ruffled.
No, right? We perceive.
And we talked about this before, too. It's that understanding of here's a statement. It's raining outside. You in your office don't have the windows. That inference is, well, I see that you're wet and you're tracking in water. Okay, that's a good inference. Or there's the fact that you're lying to me because you were late and you're like, oh, I got caught in this rainstorm, where really you were just playing in the courtyard and the sprinklers came on.
That's right. So. And what a great excuse, right?
But yeah, so this almost seems almost trivial because, this is what people do. They see a microphone. Here's a microphone. They don't kind of reason up to it, and so that's his point here. And I think scientists or an understanding of what science tends to do is say, okay, well, we can't even assume that, but that's part of our experience, our kind of universal experience as humans. So doesn't that kind of send up red flags as if this is a universal, as far as we know, at least on this earth, that people come to this, then shouldn't this be explored and understood within the context of how humanity operates, this metaphysical attempt of understanding?
Yeah, good. So he says, so my belief about the table is formed not by inference, but in what Plano calls the basic way. The belief is immediately caused by my experience rather than by my inference from previous beliefs. Now, what is his point with regard to this? Well, his point is, and again, he's talking about design arguments, right? So his point is this. He says, I think that some such faculty, this either sensus divinitatis, right, is what Calvin, he says, calls it. I think that some such faculty or disposition is responsible for the strength of belief that many of us feel when confronted with scientific facts about the alleged fine-tuning of the cosmos, or even with mundane weirdness like owls and insects, right? Just as we see, in quotes, that we're not hooked up to the matrix, right? I mean, we can't prove it, right? But we see it. We seem to know it, right? Or that other people have minds like ours. We see that the natural world around us must result from a divine intellect of astounding power and creativity. No inference is necessary, right? So that's his point here with regard to this issue of, perception and intuition and how we perceive things and non-inference, arguments and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and the sensus divinitas comes from, again, Romans 1, where, it's been revealed to all creation, or all men, that God exists, but within our unrighteousness, we suppress, we take that belief and we build it down to say, nope, that's not true. And in our unrighteousness, in our sin natural state, we object to God ruling over the universe. What, again, presuppositionalist does is say, no, you actually do, and here are points, even within your system of belief that you try to get outside of God, where you are actually using the same foundations that He provides to us within our worldview. So when you see, the starving children, oh, this is awful, God wouldn't allow this, therefore God doesn't exist. Why? Why is that awful? Having an objective value where all people can look at that picture of a starving child and say, bad, it implies all these things that the naturalistic person doesn't come up with. Well, no, that's just a bag of matter, not getting enough sustenance, and hey, well, according to theory of evolution, that should be fine. I can go ahead and feed that child too. That's fine either. But either way, it doesn't really matter. Right. What is morality in that?
Right or wrong, morally speaking, yeah. And so so with regard to these various arguments, he says, so then whereas there may be decent arguments for God's existence from apparent design, right? He says what really compels us is, many of us, he says, is to see that God designed all this is a strong instinct to do so, to perceive that God designed it, right? It's again, this, we just kind of instinctively, perceive it, right? We instinctively, it's almost like intuition. We presuppose it. Actually, we think it, right?
Yeah.
So he says the unbeliever can agree that humans indeed have a habit of seeing God in nature, but attributes this habit to a kind of evolutionary trick played on us by our mischievous genes. So they suggest, oh yeah, we have the propensity to see it that way, but it's just the genes playing a trick on us.
Yeah.
And we say, no, it really is designed. That's what's going on, and it's not genes. It's put there by a creator. By God. Yeah,
even in Dawkins' God Delusion, he talks about the very fact that religion is helpful for the survival of the species. What he doesn't do in that book is then say, and we should be evolving out of that right now, so we should be destroying that. It seems odd that if there are things that are implanted in us that help us survive, and there are still a ton of people that have a understanding of religion, why is it that you're trying to advance the species in that way? It seems like that's a design attempt to meddle with nature that doesn't care about where it's going or the consistency or the ability to know things. But here, he's trying to make us all atheists, which I'm assuming if it has a thing for survival, Dawkins is trying to kill us all because he doesn't want us to survive.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's the secret believer in God, and he's trying to be the Genghis Khan of the UK.
So he ends this particular chapter by asking the question, why would God allow us to get it wrong? Right? The believers often attributes the success of science to God. The question is, yes, but science isn't always successful, and we get it wrong so many times. So why, if indeed God is allowing us to do that, why do we get it wrong so many times, right? And so he says, well, if God's designer designed us in the cosmos, why make it so hard for creatures like us to get to the truth, right? Another way of looking at this is we should be extremely grateful, he said. So, right? So it's hard, but on the other side of the coin is we do, at least to a certain extent, are able to understand and know what's going on. And so he says we should be extremely grateful for how far we have come in science, even if we're far from the journey's end. We look at science as something extremely difficult, but it could have easily been much more, even more difficult, even impossible. There's absolutely no doubt that the current science works better than the science of a few centuries ago, and we've learned that. So, we can say, well, why is it so hard, or why do we get it wrong if God designed us this way? Well, he's suggesting that, but we have gotten it right, to a certain extent, and so we should be grateful for that portion of it, right? The other side of the coin.
Yeah, you don't really want to go from swords to atom bombs in a single leap,
right?
Especially in a short period of time, because then you're not learning about, okay, well, swords. Look at the battlefield and look at the blood and the bodies that are there at the massive scale, because we have 60,000 men because we need that against the other 30,000, and we've just slaughtered a bunch of people. But then to say, oh, within a flip of a switch, I can take out entire cities based on that. There's should be an attempt to learn from kind of our mistakes or where we came from, and we have this understanding too, even within in our own world, of saying, look at the 1% of all wealth owners. Those who work and become the millionaires and billionaires, they're the ones that kind of are good at keeping their money. Their children's generations and their children's generation are the ones who are most likely out of everybody in the entire economic spectrum to drop down out of their out of their economic class, because they didn't have to start with zero and
struggle to get it.
So here's the survival of the fittest here. Is right. It's always asking that other question. It's not why would God allow this, but
so that's kind of an evolutionary account of scientific theories, right?
yeah. In fact, he goes on to say our scientific theories evolve because they were designed by us.
Yeah.
So there you go.
So in any case, and here's the end of it here. Patience is a virtue, so is skepticism. He says, all of us should be skeptical about the claim that science has shown that God doesn't exist. Even if there were a scientific argument against God, we would do well to be skeptical of it, since there are good reasons to doubt the truth of the scientific premises themselves, right? So, so that's really the bottom line here with regard to this particular theory.
But that doesn't stop other scientists from attempting to go outside of their natural bounds and tell us that God doesn't exist.
Right, and then the next chapter, he's going to look again at a couple of scientists that try to do that, right?
Yes, because once again, the scientists and politicians of today are the new priests that are attempting to convert us to Dawkinism.
So it's extremely difficult to get physics-based metaphysical answers.
It's almost impossible.
Yeah, right. And so the question is whether or not God exists is a metaphysical question, and the take on this chapter is how difficult that is to try to use physics to get there. In fact, we probably can't do that.
All right, and we even see that within the Gospels. Jesus does all these miracles in front of the Pharisees, and then they say, well, all right, I believe that those exist and people have been healed, but it's really because of this other thing that he's got the spirit of Beelzebub in him. And so even with a physical understanding of seeing isn't always believing. In fact, that's again what the Bible talks about, is what presuppositionalism kind of preaches on the back end, is you're not dividing camps into these are your evidences and these are my evidences. It says, no, everything is in God's evidence, and it's through our worldview that is given to us by God when he changes us from hearts of stone to hearts of flesh. He gives us, he makes us a new creation. We put off the old man, we put on the new. It's through that understanding that we have the appropriate understanding of looking at the world as God intends us to it, as he wants us to see it. And it's through his objective standard of science and his way of thinking, what we call logic, and through his morality. That's how we exist in harmony with what the world is. And ultimately, if there is a God, then we should live according to what his standards are.
Yeah, good. Well said. Yeah. All right. So the next chapter, the God-failed hypothesis. Any questions that has the God is God the failed hypothesis, right? That some believe he is, and he's going to deal with that time.
Right. So that'll be the end of the science section, and then we move on to morality, which is a really fun one and a little bit challenging too. Just trying to wrap our heads around what Mitch Stokes is saying. But in between those two chapters, we're going to have a couple episodes that were fun to do, and so we'll take just a small pause, but it's still within the book pages.
That's right.
So we'll do one more chapter, and then at the split of them, we'll do two episodes that are not going to be within the book, but they'll still relate to the book. So after that,
very related to the book.
Very, maybe. So we'll hope you stay subscribed. All the little things that come up on the screen at the end, you're able to check out other videos and other playlists. And then cavetofthecross.com is where you can go for other things. Check out the books that we link to, that we talk about. Comment, and I'm always looking for a good troll. So I'm going to answer as best as I can. So hopefully that helps, and we'll see you next time.